Hello, everybody. My name is Brian Anderson. I'm with Eagle Technologies, and we actually made it. We made it to part three. So today I'm going to be talking about offerings in Eagle's portfolio that help with a lot of the stuff that we outlined in part one and part two. And since we're not only going to be talking about blue and red team security, but backup and recovery, I have a whole gaggle of nerds to help me. So please don't hesitate to bring the difficult questions. We've got the gentlemen that lead our blue and red team, Adam and Dustin, and then we also have Patrick and Anthony who focus a lot on backups. So I appreciate everybody joining, and let's get to it. All right. So, like I said, we're at part three. So, just to kind of quickly recap part one and part two, most notably the things that are relevant for today's talks. Part one was mostly about on-prem security from the perspective of a white hat hacker, aka our lead pen tester, Adam, who's on today. And really, the takeaways I got out of that is that the tools have been largely commoditized. They have great YouTube tutorials, and they're readily available on GitHub. And the other thing I noticed is that, really, Adam's trying to cover a lot of ground quick. So he goes for low-hanging fruit. That means legacy protocols that are vulnerable, known vulnerabilities, poor policy decisions. Those are the frequent targets in that on-prem world. Part two was more focused on this new SaaS world that we live in with app-to-app permissions, those potentially scary bearer tokens, and really we tried to show some unique ways that identity can be exploited to cause some serious damage and even financial loss. And one of the key takeaways is that it was often done without ever touching on-prem infrastructure or endpoints. So before I get moving, I just want to point out, please don't hesitate to ask questions, even those tough ones. As they pop into your head, one of these guys will interrupt me and we'll walk through that as well. So today, as I already said, we're going to go over solutions Eagle has to help with the dangers that we covered in the last two webinars. I'll do my absolute best to reference the previous examples as we go along, so this all glues together. But I have to say, I'm going to move pretty fast through the first part of it because the real star of the show is EagleWatch XDR. That's a service that we've been slowly piloting and rolling out to select customers for almost 2 years now. So, a large narrative today, something that I hope I don't screw up getting this point across, is that we decided to create EagleWatch XDR because we believed that the available solutions out there weren't adequately solving all the issues that our customers are seeing. So I always start with this slide, but I'm really not going to cover it in detail today. You've already seen me cover it twice in this series. I would just say that I hope that you notice and see that design in depth strategy on display as we talk through some of these solutions and why we built them the way we did. So we feel pretty strongly here that any talk about security has to involve a discussion around backup recovery and what you're going to do to protect that data at multiple levels. So let's get into this real quick. So I've talked about this on previous webinars, but Eagle was a backup and recovery powerhouse before I ever started working here. And it's ultimately what pulled us into cybersecurity. Our goal's always been to protect customer data. And when customers started calling us, gosh, it's been about 8 years to recover from a breach, we quickly realized we needed to do more than just recover the data. We needed to identify the threat, figure out how the bad actor got in, and prevent future intrusions. And that's really what has led us to today. But we have some pretty good Commvault and backup prowess. We're the largest reseller in the middle of the country. We're the only folks, as far as I know, that even do tier one support. You call us, you get to know our guys by name. And so that's my long-winded way of saying we can deliver in a lot of unique ways as it relates to backup and recovery. So a couple of soapbox slides. One thing that always ends up coming up in conversations is immutability when we talk about backup and security. And what's interesting is that most of our vendors have tried to reduce this to a checkbox. But if you ask an Eagle engineer if a certain solution is immutable, we're probably going to reply with another question. What does that mean to you? And as I show on the screen, immutability isn't a feature or a checkbox. It's an architecture that spans all of your resources, your apps, your storage, your backup, your software. So If you want to reduce it to a checkbox, absolutely, we can integrate immutability into any of our offerings, but we're going to have a couple more questions. The other point I wanted to make is we meet a lot of customers that have a lot of point products so they can back up this growing list of software as a service out there. And so just know that this is in our wheelhouse. Commvault has more capabilities to do SaaS backup than any product I've ever seen or heard of. And we can integrate this into any of the solutions that we talk to you about. So it's just something to keep in mind. So, with our new customers or our new setups, we obviously have a lot of security hardening that we integrate into the install, but we still have hundreds, if not thousands, of customers that we set up many moons ago. So we've had this for some time, but we have a security hardening engagement. It's got a growing list of actions we perform, over 60 actions. I got the price tag hanging up there right there. For what we do and the time we spent, it is money well spent. We've done entire presentations on this topic, so I'm not going to get into it today. One thing I do want to mention is be on the lookout for this service to evolve a little bit. Much in the way we often recommend that you do yearly pen tests due to the way things change in this landscape, we're starting to notice a need to offer some sort of service like that as well, where not only do we go back and audit that all those previous actions have been performed, but we take into account new capabilities with the software and account for the new way the bad actors are acting. So be on the lookout for that. And of course, if you haven't done a hardening engagement, please reach out to your account exec, to your engineer, whichever one you like best. So we can architect backups in quite a few ways for our customers. But one thing I wanted to mention that has been really successful over the last 5 or 6 years is managed protection. We can incorporate mutability, offsite copies. We can address all of your concerns and tailor something for you. But what's really great about it is we pull the drudgery out of your responsibility. As we often hear from our customers, backups are boring. They give them to the new guy. But you guys would also agree that they're really important. So we create a scenario where you can still go in and do backups and restores, but we keep it healthy, we keep it updated, we do daily verification that your jobs are successful. We also make sure that the recoveries are going to work. So we offload that drudgery. We let you guys focus on innovation and other exciting things. And as I've said before, this has been really popular with our customers. And then finally, not all storage copies are the same. Cloud copies are that last line of defense. If you're using cloud copies to restore from a breach, you're probably in a pretty bad space. But it is a necessary element. And unfortunately, we noticed with our customers that the hyperscalers were making it difficult to budget, right? There's ingress, egress, listing fees. So we came to the rescue with Eagle S3. There's no hidden fees. We support it cradle to grave with the whole solution, right? And we even have enhanced ways to return your data. As any of you that have tried to download 10 terabytes of data from the cloud know, the data almost has no value by the time you get it back. So you can use our big fat pipe to pull that data back down, or we can do it old school in a car, 75 miles an hour on the highway. But once again, this is really your last line of defense, but we wanted to give you something that you could budget for, that was easily consumable, that also allowed us to add a lot of expertise, even when it comes to returning the data to you. I think at present, we are managing something ridiculous like 5 petabytes of data for our customers right now. So outside of Commvault and basic backups, I think many of you know what Zerto is. It's kind of the 800-pound gorilla in backup and orchestration, right? It gives you the ability to build these very complicated DR workflows, to test them in a bubble, to show upper management with these audit style reports that you're doing your job and that you're confident you can bring everything back online. But because of that journal-based backup technology, they've been able to do some really cool stuff as it relates to security. And we've covered this before, but essentially, they're able to inspect every single write that's going into that journal. There's a fairly sophisticated algorithm that does that. You can go read about it on their blog. Some pretty awesome math. But when you pair that with everything else they built, you have a scenario where you know exactly when the data is encrypted, you know exactly what data was encrypted, and you're able to automate a very pointed restore. So you can go back mere seconds before the data was altered and only restore the data. that has been encrypted. That is a really impressive story. So to use a Spinal Tap reference, if you want to turn the volume knob up to 11, they also can partner with HPE to build these cyber resilient vaults. So we're talking about an environment that has real-time encryption detection, spare hardware, fully air-gapped with immutable snapshots, and then full recovery orchestration, right? Truly volume knob up to 11. And one thing that I always like to point out when we talk about cyber resilience vaults or just Zerto in general is that this doesn't have to be all of your infrastructure, right? I would say a lot of our customers have just isolated those top 25 apps that really shouldn't ever go down. And that is where the Zerto infrastructure is put in place. So once again, I think it's money well spent, especially when you target the really important applications. And then finally, deception really belongs in the blue team area, but this is a product that Commvault recently acquired. And think of it as deception at volume 11. They have these highly sophisticated threat sensors. It's cloud managed. You just have to deploy an OVA on-prem. And now you've got a sophisticated sensor that returns SQL queries. It presents live files you can interact with. We're talking cameras with live feeds. It makes it very hard for bad actors to know that they're about to lurch you to their presence. And like I said before, I can honestly say that ThreatWise offers incredible value considering what it costs. There's a funny aside to this. We got on 30 minutes before this webinar, and as I said earlier, Adam, our lead pen tester, is on, and he saw this slide, and he had a funny story from recently. So, Adam, if you don't mind coming off on mute, I enjoyed hearing this, and
Yeah.
I think our customers would too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was on an engagement recently and a couple devices caught my eye, kind of typical low-hanging fruit. So I started to scan and probe them and, they look like Windows devices. I could connect and browse the file system. I could execute certain software up into a certain point. And as I was kind of going through that, I thought, maybe something about this is a little odd, but it definitely, seems like it's a vulnerable server. And then the client had tipped me off, well, that's actually a honeypot. And so we had a good chuckle, and I was like, well, I'm glad you told me because I probably would have spent even more time trying to get some of those exploits to work. So that was one of the first times that I had ran into that in the wild that I know of. Kind of without that customer feedback, I probably wouldn't have known. And in hindsight, there's certain things you can look at that maybe would have tipped you off, but I think, proper placement of honeypots and just understanding, if we do get compromised, which subnet, VLAN, however you segment your network, where should we sprinkle these honeypots? How should we name them? Spoof them on the domain, things like that. I think it's highly effective, and even if the bad actor is able to identify it's a honeypot, that's assuming, they've already probed it at least somewhat, and that's likely already triggered an alert. So the honeypot was definitely doing its job. But yeah, that was one of the more interesting run-ins I had with the honeypot. And what impressed me was just how sophisticated the emulation was. You could really go above and beyond what you can with most honeypots before you reach a dead end. And so it definitely stumped me, and I spent some time. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a great story. Because a lot of honeypot technology, even though it's valuable, sometimes it's just has an open port, right? And when you connect to that port, you tip them off. But the bad actor also knows what just happened, right? So that was a great
Yeah.
story to hear Adam tell. All right, thanks, Adam. Um, so that's into the backup stuff. We talk about backups a lot. We've got lots of YouTubes. I really just flew past everything. But if any of those backup related items piqued your interest, don't hesitate to reach out once again to your Eagle account executive or engineer. So now we're actually getting into red team security. And Adam, I'm going to bring you online one more time. I didn't even warn you about this. Are you a good guy that acts like a bad guy? Or are you a bad guy who acts like a good guy? Thoughts?
Wow, that's a good question. Maybe a little bit of both.
All right. Good answer. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about red team security. We've covered this before. But Simply put, most of our organizations are very focused on blue team and they really have a red team. So with a pen test, there's really no quicker way to find out what's wrong in your environment and the way that Eagle does it, how to fix it. So I always point out that we're not talking about compliance-based testing, where you get a 90-page Nessus scanner report that entitles you to do business in some sector. We're actually talking about a real pen test where we emulate the bad guys, right? We emulate their techniques. We actually prove that we can weaponize those exploits. But where we differ a little bit is then Adam and his team prioritizes that list. So you know what to focus on first, you know how to get the best value out of your time. And then he provides advice on the mitigation. And then we take it a step further and we offer a free 90-day retest so that if you do plug all those holes, we can demonstrate a report that verifies that and you can show that to upper management. So once again, we've architected our approach to maximize value. And I think it really resonates with our customers. So we can do vulnerability assessments. We can also do customized assessments, but I really just wanted to cover the two most popular offerings that we have. And of course, the first is an external pen test, right? This is where we act like we know nothing about your environment. Maybe we just start with a DNS name. And then our goal is to collect as much public information as we can and then use those tactics, techniques, and procedures to try to breach your network or exfiltrate data, right? So this is a really popular pen test because a lot of people are worried about how easy it is for someone to penetrate that moat in the castle and moat strategy, right? And I believe this is our most popular pen test. I always do mention that CISA does this for free if you're a federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial government. I think that's all of them. Oh, and critical infrastructure. But it is automated. It does offer some value, but I think they're backed up like a year right now. And then my favorite pen test, I think the one that offers the most value, and this was what we covered a lot in part one of this webinar series, our internal pen tests. So here we act like we have an internal foothold and we try to see what we can do with that very limited access. So as opposed to breaching the network and exfiltrating data, we're trying to move laterally and escalate permissions. And I'm pretty proud to say that Adam and his team is usually domain admin on day two. So to that end, this is a really impactful way to show upper management that you've got some problems you need to solve, right? But essentially, we put in this beacon. It's a Dropbox. You'll notice this is the case we're giving away. It's basically the exact same thing we're giving away. And then Adam and his team starts to scan the network. Hopefully he doesn't hit those deception honeypots, identify vulnerabilities. He does a whole host of things that we've covered in detail on previous webinars. But once again, he then prioritizes them, tells you what you should focus on first. He provides advice on mitigation, and then he will also provide a free 90-day retest so you can demonstrate to upper management that you plugged those holes. So once again, in closing, there is a ton of value to pen tests. And really the only other thing I'll say is you may not hear this from a lot of people that try to sell stuff, but we recommend to our customers that they have at least two pen test orgs they alternate between. The reason being is that pen testing is it's highly specialized, right? And everyone has their different specialties and what they're going to focus on. So typically you're going to get the most value hopping back and forth between at least two organizations. Hopefully one of those is Eagle. But that's my last piece of advice on red team. So as I mentioned, blue team is where I wanted to spend most of the time today so that I could talk about EagleWatch XDR. But before I did that, I would be remiss if I didn't mention another offering we have in our portfolio, and that's Cynet. So EagleWatch XDR is more of a complicated discussion and offering. And if you're simply looking for an effective EDR solution that doesn't break the budget, well, I'd say Cynet's your answer. I've covered in previous webinars all of the due diligence we went through many, many moons ago to figure out that we thought Cynet was the best product. And I'm happy to say that due diligence has paid off because in the most recent MITRE ATT&CK evaluation, codenamed Turla Edition, they really stomped everybody. They were 100% detection across the board. And what's really key to mention here is that was with their out-of-box settings on day one. So on day two, vendors are allowed to make changes based on how they performed. And that's typically what the vendors show off in their marketing, right? So they will change a bunch of settings so that they can perform better. Well, all of those settings changes don't reflect what the customer's getting. So we're not big fans of day two. So once again, Signet kicked butt on day one. Pretty impactful in my opinion. And once again, if you're just looking for an EDR to solve a specific problem, we should probably talk about Signet. All right. So before I talk about EagleWatch XDR, I kind of wanted to highlight the problem that we set out to solve, the reason that we created the service, right? Because that's a pretty heavy lift and it's taken us a lot of time. So I thought the best way to do that would be to take the most recent report that I was able to find that talks about the types of cyber attacks. And so this is a recent report from our friends at Arctic Wolf. Thank you. And I was going to dig down into this a little bit before I talk about the takeaways. So prepare for some pie chart hell. It's about 4 slides. So as you can see here, I think the biggest takeaway when you look at the broadest view of what I'm going to cover is that almost 30% of attacks were business email compromise attacks. So that's what we talked about in part two of the webinar, the kind of attacks that really exist outside of your castle and moat and can be very damaging. And as you can see, they're already a third of all attacks, and I would expect that number to rise as well. So let's take BEC out of the equation and look at everything else that's left. Essentially, we have two big pieces of the pie here. We have user action, and then we have external exposure. So what I'm going to do next is focus on those two and talk about them in more detail. So let's look at external attacks first. So well, you can see there's two really big categories that jump out. There's known vulnerabilities and external remote access. And it's important to mention that in the case of external remote access, those attacks were perpetrated with valid user credentials, right? We're talking about credentials that were phished, purchased from an access broker, or just part of a dark web leak, which is something that Adam looks for on his pen tests. The known vulnerabilities are also meant that those vulnerabilities were potentially patchable prior to exploitation. I think the last takeaway is to look at the zero-day exploits, right? Those are the ones a lot of folks are understandably worried about. They're actually a pretty small chunk, right? Only 3.4%. But when you look at the inverse of that, that means that 96.6% of attacks were preventable in one way or another. I repeat, 96.6% of attacks were preventable. So before I round out the points I was trying to make here, let's look at user attacks. So really all you see here is that users are still succumbing to phishing, they're still reusing passwords, and they're still downloading malicious files. I thought one thing that was interesting is that social engineering was smaller than I thought, but there's a really excellent 60 Minutes segment that was only 2 weeks ago, and it was focused on this cyber criminal group called Scattered Spider. And in a nutshell, that is these Russian mega groups have started partnering with young hackers in Canada and the United States so they can take advantage of the fact that those folks speak the king's English, if you know what I mean, so they can be better at social engineering. So I would expect that number to rise, but it's also notable that that massive casino hack that happened this year was actually done by Scattered Spider, and they relied on those English-speaking folks in the U.S. to call in and get a password reset. So just an example of how we're going to see the landscape change over time. All right. So what does all this mean? Why did I make you look at so many pie charts? I think for one, business email compromise is on the rise. And as I mentioned in part two, that is where we're seeing a lot of our customers having the least capabilities or coverage in the way of detecting and mitigating those threats. External exposure is also a huge lion's share. And of that lion's share, known vulnerabilities and remote access are a problem. Users are still doing the same stuff they've always done. And then I think the biggest takeaway that's really relevant for today is that 96.6% of those attacks were preventable. So before I talk about why I think folks haven't solved those problems, let's talk about the reality that that kind of puts us in, right? So really, we live in this post-breach detection and mitigation reality, right? You log into a portal, you have an alert, you make sure that you've mitigated the threat, and then you look at the next alert or you hop into another portal. Depends how many products you have, right? So, it kind of makes you ask the question, what are we doing wrong here? Why am I just post breach, mitigate, and alert guy, right? So I think a lot of folks know what the answer is. It's security posture improvement, but it's a really ominous task, right? It's very time consuming, requires a lot of expertise. But the reality is we want to bring a service to bear. This is why we created EagleWatch XDR, because we think there's an incredible amount of value attacking the 96.6% of intrusions that were preventable. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but I really wanted to build up to that before we got into EagleWatch XDR. We feel like this is the problem that we're not being seen adequately solved in the industry. So here we are. So first, let's talk about the tool that we chose because, I just bagged a lot on post-breach detection, which is EDR. But the reality is you absolutely need it. And if we were going to have a comprehensive service, we had to pick one. Um, so I have to tell you, the due diligence didn't take that long, and it has a lot to do with Microsoft and the fact that they have an unfair advantage in this space. They own your operating system. For most of our customers, they own your identity, they own your email, and they've been able to invest a lot of time in an ecosystem that takes advantage of that. So you can see the Gartner quadrant over there, how well they are respected in this segment. I'll get back to that Gartner quadrant later on in the presentation. But this was really why we chose their ecosystem, and I'm going to try to explain that as we move through some of the next slides. So part of the ecosystem is Defender for Endpoint, and I'm going to cover that first. I'm going to go through four major sections. So the first thing that you get as part of Defender for Endpoint is you get full threat and vulnerability management. And once again, they have a special window into this because they own a lot of these pieces and parts that you use, right? But for the purposes of what we're looking at now, it's related to endpoint, but they can also do this for identity as well. But they can fully index everything that's on that endpoint. They can index all of the patches, all of the known vulnerabilities, the ones that are being exploited. They prioritize them. They let you know what to focus on first. And then they give you these really nice exposure scores so you can see how individual endpoints compare to each other and how you as an organization compare to other organizations. With our larger customers, they typically have to go out and acquire a completely separate threat and vulnerability management application, right? This is something that's built right in to Defender for Endpoint. Another feature we really like that once again gets back to that unfair advantage are attack surface reduction rules. So these aren't post breach, these are preventative. So there are well over 300 rules you can employ that block potentially malicious behavior. So think maybe an office productivity app shouldn't be able to launch a third-party executable. Or maybe any executable shouldn't be able to launch and immediately start sending or receiving bulk data from the internet. So the problem is that if you turn these rules on, you can break a lot of stuff. There's a lot of aging applications and processes that don't behave or adhere to modern security protections. So typically, when we take on an EagleWatch XDR customer, we oftentimes see that these ASR rules have been set up in audit mode, but they've never really been turned on. So part of our service, a big part of that security posture improvement, is that we walk through this journey with you and we help you audit these policies in a responsible fashion, and we help you turn them on, whitelist those legacy applications that do have a use case, and we help get you into this world where you're not alerting on breaches, you're preventing them before they happen. Naturally, it comes with AV. I don't think there's much I need to say here. It also has really effective endpoint detection and response. And, just once again, talking to that unfair advantage they have, it's been a few years now, but they realized that they needed enhanced kernel-based logging. So what did they do? They just went right over to the Windows development team and they had them create the logging. It's a fun acronym that I always forget and Adam has to correct me on. But the point is it was roughly a year before they allowed any of the other major players in the space to even have access to that logging. So they're able to evolve at a faster speed than a lot of their competitors. And it's very effective as a result. So here's probably the most important takeaway on the Defender for Endpoint section, and that's the fact that they have really effective automatic investigation and remediation. And the reason that that is relevant is the notion of having some dude awake at night, what's typically referred to as hands on keyboard, isn't really sufficient anymore. Bad actors move at machine speed. Dustin and I gave you an example of this in part two where an actor that had, excuse me, a customer that had reused a password, a bad actor moving at machine speed was able to bypass MFA, create their own MFA source, create their own delegation rules on the inbox, set up their own forwarding rules, and set up persistent OAuth connections. They were able to do that inside of 30 seconds. That's not nearly enough time for a human to look at all of that telemetry and decide how to act. So with an EagleWatch XDR customer, we lock that down in the next 5 seconds, right? Doesn't matter who's awake and who's watching. It's also interesting to mention that this can be highly prescriptive. So with EagleWatch XDR, we can get a better understanding of what's important to you, your appetite for risk, your appetite for locking down infrastructure, and we can reach beyond the endpoint and make changes in the identity space or in the email space to further enhance the response and the security. So it's a really important piece of what we set out to do, and it enables us to do it once again at machine speed. So before we get to talk about the rest of the ecosystem, I just wanted to wrap a bow on this. You get threat and vulnerability management that's very mature. You get those preventative attack surface reduction rules. You get AV and EDR, and then you get remediation and investigation that works at machine speed. And then finally, you get access to our threat experts. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that works on an upcoming slide. All right, so what about beyond the endpoint? Let's get to what we really covered in part two of this series. We recognized that you still have this castle and moat that you have to protect, but that we were also living in this world of guerrilla warfare, right? Where you have all of these app-to-app connections and you have bad guys fluttering and floating around trying to take advantage of that. And we showed this in different ways, but it's created this type of reality, right? Where we need something that we call cross perimeter defense. It's a notion that maybe we start in email, we then hit endpoint and on-prem. More and more nowadays, we hop right over that and we exist solely in the identity and the SaaS or the workload world, right? So this is what Microsoft has created to combat that. We have Defender for Office 365. We have Defender for Endpoint, which I just went over. And then we have Defender for Identity and Defender for SaaS or cloud apps. And then if you want to turn the volume knob up to 11, we can introduce the Microsoft Sentinel SIM. That's going to allow you to ingest more telemetry from things like your firewall or your VMware. And that's exciting because that's where Microsoft has deployed another unfair advantage, and that's their $11 billion investment in OpenAI. So that's where you see a lot of these really impressive AI deep threat hunting queries that can quite literally find and correlate data that a human just simply isn't capable of. So it's pretty impressive. So to look at this in one different way to kind of understand the different pieces and parts, right? Once again, you've got email protection capabilities, endpoint protection capabilities, identity, and then you can protect those SaaS apps and workloads as well. So a little bit later, I'll talk about how we offer this up with EagleWatch XDR. But the reality is, right, is that this is a service that you guys can deploy yourself. So let's talk a little bit about where we think we offer value and why you would want to consider us. So getting back to the Gartner quadrant, once again, if you look at what Gartner says about the strengths, it's all the stuff I covered, right? The unfair advantage, the whole ecosystem play, the preventative measures like attack surface reduction rules. I really have covered all that pretty quickly, but we went through all of that. When you look at the cautions, it's the same old thing you always hear about Microsoft. They eventually make really great tools, but at the end of the day, they're tools and they require a lot of expertise and knowledge to take advantage of, right? So that's what we set out to do and what we've slowly been improving upon for, gosh, almost 3 years now. So once again, the other big win using our expertise is that we put about 50% of the effort in this service into security posture improvements, right? We take you on a journey where we attack those 97% of preventable attacks. And what I've got here on the screen is by no means an exhaustive list, but simply put, we work with you at the speed you are capable of and comfortable with, and we guide you through all of these improvements. So our goal is to get you to a point where we don't have to rely on that never-ending post-breach detection and mitigation cycle that we've all sadly become so used to. It's pretty cool, right? So about 4 years ago, I started asking folks that had some sort of managed SOC, what they thought about it. And the one thing that almost everybody said is that the communication sucked, right? They only heard from them when they forwarded alerts. They never heard from them. So we wanted to overcorrect if we were going to bring a service. So for starters, you have real-time access to our security experts. We set up a custom Teams channel where you can talk to our guys in real time. That's also where we keep all of the documentation on what we've accomplished, what we've seen, and what we are looking to accomplish. So once again, real-time access to our experts. And then on a weekly basis, our experts email you, right? They tell you about what they've seen in the last week, and then they talk about what improvements they made and what we need to work on next, right? So it's very prescriptive in nature, and it's obviously a partnership that we're setting out here to accomplish. And then finally, we do quarterly reviews so that we can demonstrate that you're getting value in the service. So we rely pretty heavily on those security scores to demonstrate that. What you're looking at here is a real anonymized security score from one of our existing customers. And then we consult you on what we should be working on next. And of course, that's the type of content, once again, that you want to take to upper management to demonstrate that, once again, you're getting value out of the service. So, as a recap on what you get, before I talk about how it's packaged and how we offer it, you get access to our cybersecurity expertise. We do full onboarding and management for all of these pieces and parts I was talking about. Things like helping you make sure that we've hybrid joined your machines so that we can enforce policy, we can enforce that the endpoint is protected, setting up ASR rules. And then, of course, from a daily perspective, we verify that all those endpoints are healthy and configured. We really target missing clients because, as I think you guys know well, you put an atom on one single machine that's not protected, and eventually he's going to cause some damage. So we built a ton of custom remediation scripts that verify that all of your clients are covered and healthy. And then we work with you on those custom automated policies and remediations. Once again, that's the idea of understanding where your risk lies and how we want to respond to threats. And once again, so we can do that at machine speed. Of course, we help triage the alerts. You can always communicate with us in real time as we work through that. And then I have it in red because it deserves to be 50% of the slide and it's not. But then once again, we take you on that security posture journey where we help implement all of these policies and remediations. So once again, we can get out of this post-breach detection reality that a lot of our customers are in now. And then, of course, we want to demonstrate the value and stay communicated with you. So we do weekly progress updates and quarterly reviews. So this is how we offer it to our customers. I would hope that through part one and part two, talking about the castle and moat and the guerrilla warfare, that you'll understand why our base offering has to include Defender for identity and Defender for endpoint, right? We feel like if we aren't covering you from those two perspectives, we're not adequately doing our job. But then we also recognize you may have other solutions in your portfolio, or you may want to, crawl before you walk. So we also offer user awareness training. We can introduce a Microsoft Sentinel SIM so you can get more telemetry and take advantage of some of those deep threat queries. And then something that we're piloting with existing customers that we'll be releasing in mass sooner is Defender for Cloud Apps or SaaS and Defender for Office 365 so that we can get the full portfolio out to our customers. We know that you guys are all at a different part in this journey. So let us know what next steps are. It could be as simple as filling out that EagleWatch XDR survey. But if you want to step back and have a broader conversation about what you're doing now, so Eagle can help consult you on where we think you should be and how we can get there in the smartest way, reach out to your AE or SC, right? I would also mention that we're working with some customers that are using EagleWatch XDR now, so that we can do a couple of testimonials. So be on the lookout for that too. We've had really great feedback from our existing customers.